Well, thank you, Robert. It's wonderful to be here tonight. I've been very privileged throughout my life to speak in Masonic lodges like this, and I'm descended from a long line of Masons, although I never have become one, but I have a deep and abiding respect for the principles of Freemasonry, and I was always impressed for example, that Robert Burns, the poet, "Oh, what a gift he gave us to see ourselves as others see us," in the 1780s, belonged to a lodge in Ayrshire in Scotland, Scottish Rite, of course, that included women. Pretty profound for the 18th century, huh? And there was a lodge about the same time in Vienna, and we even have a painting of the lodge, and the lodge looks very, very similar to this by a member of that lodge. This was the lodge that Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart belonged to, and its Grand Master, Ignaz Bold, was the man for whom the Magic Flute was written, and he becomes a hero of this great tribute to the wonderful benefits of Freemasonry and of that first principle of Freemasonry, brotherly love. That lodge included black members from Africa. They were called Ethiopians. I doubt that they were from Ethiopia itself. That simply was a generic term used by the southern Germans for someone from Africa. But the lodge was far ahead of itself. It too included women. The anti-slavery component of Freemasonry emerges in both of those, and many, many scholars over the years have written tribute to that. That did not prevent what happened during the American Civil War. How many of you have been to the battlefield at Gettysburg? I bet the Masons have all seen one particular statue there, haven't they? The two brothers, both who were here in California. One wore gray and the other wore blue, and they are embracing one another. I wish that all Freemasons had followed that tenet of brotherly love, but the issues that divided the Union during the Civil War were far too profound for that. And America was as divided then as it is sadly today in this night of the debates. And one hopes we will never see that division again, but that we can come together, and perhaps the principles of Freemasonry stand out as an example of how such healing might be able to come about. My study of Freemasonry here in San Luis Obispo was largely guided by J. Baron Wiley, who I think Jack Spaulding and a few others may remember Baron's presentations on the Knights of Malta and other aspects of Freemasonry. And I got to learn quite a bit about the King David Lodge in the process. And it struck me from the beginning that there was a lacunae, something that historians don't like, a gap where something couldn't be explained. Because Masonry started here in 1860, 1861 with the formation of the San Luis Obispo Lodge number 148, which is the first lodge in California to surrender its charter in, is it 1865, I believe, that it was surrendered. Unfortunately, we don't have many details about that lodge. As Robert points out on your website, all the records were burnt in the San Francisco fire of 1906, so along with countless other records that would explain so much to historians, but we have to write around it. As a historian who loves the archives and loves the documents, I have to tell you that coincidences always perk my interest and perk the interest of any decent historian, and I began to see a whole lot of coincidences. For example, the fact that this Lodge 148 we know was founded by Walter Murray, the man for whose paper I write today, the Tribune, which he founded in 1869, and by Romualdo Pacheco, by any count the long-term leader of the Republican Party in San Luis Obispo County. Pacheco was what we would call a Fremont Republican. He personally knew and was admired and deeply admired John C. Fremont, the first Republican candidate for the presidency of the United States, who may be said to be the father of the old Republican Party as distinguished from the modern Republican Party, which would have substantial difference with some of the things that Fremont believed in. But Fremont came to San Luis Obispo for the first time to take California away from the Mexicans. Romualdo Pacheco, who was one of the sons of Romualdo Pacheco Sr., who died in the Battle of Cahenga Pass in 1831. His widowed mother was the object of great pity. At the age of 18, she had 2 orphaned boys. She was used goods. Nobody wanted to marry her. And her first cousin, Juan Bautista Alvarado, the Mexican governor of California, literally said, if there's anyone out there who would marry this poor widow who's past her prime, I'll give them land very generously. And in fact, when Captain John Wilson married Ramona Carrillo Pacheco Wilson, he gave Captain Wilson the 38,270 acre Rancho La Cañada de los Osos y Pecho Isla, and Captain Wilson said, you know, that Chorro Rancho over there, it's only 7,000 acres. I'd like that too. So he got most of the Chorro Valley, Cuesta College, Men's Colony, a few other things thrown in. But Captain Wilson had a secret from his wife. She discovered it very quickly on the marriage night. He was afflicted with a social disease. We won't go any further into that, even though minors aren't present. But she said, I'll have nothing to do with you, Captain. You must live on the ranch. And the captain said, fine, as long as I have the say in raising your 2 sons. And he said that Romualdo and his brother should be sent to the Presbyterians in the Hawaiian Islands to be educated. Well, those Presbyterians included the Dole family, of Dole canning and sugar fame and others, were all Scottish Rite Freemasons. So Romualdo came into Masonry quite logically from the people who educated him in the Hawaiian Islands. He got a very, very fine education. By all accounts, he was truly a brilliant individual. And when Walter Murray arrived in San Luis Obispo in 1853, London educated, a clerk in the London court system, studying to become a solicitor in the English legal system, the 2 bonded very closely together. They were cohorts in the Committee of Vigilance of 1858, which put down the Bandido epic of San Luis Obispo history, which made this town one of the most feared towns in the entire American West. We have a few statements here and there that Murray made to his brother Alexander Murray, who became the postmaster of San Luis Obispo and who also owned the largest bar in San Luis Obispo. He called it a saloon, and it actually did have lace curtains in it, but it was a typical Western bar where many fights were already breaking out over secessionist versus pro-union people. Even before the election of Abraham Lincoln, those tensions had come to California. And Alexander wrote to his brother Walter, who was in Santa Barbara at the time on a legal case, that something must be done to bond this region to the Union. And Walter no sooner got back into San Luis Obispo when he approached Pacheco, evidently, we have no written record for this, and said, let's start a Masonic lodge. So Lodge 148 came into existence from that meeting. It's Alexander's observations that tell us how divided this town was and how close we came to becoming a part of something called the Territory of the Colorado, which would succeed from California with the approval of the United States Senate in a bill first proposed in 1859. The Territory of the Colorado extended from here. San Luis Obispo would be its territorial capital, all the way to El Paso, Texas. And that would have been ripe territory for succession. Los Angeles, as I have written in recent columns, was a hotbed of secession. The only English language newspaper in town was very pro-slavery and urged secession again with editorials even before the election of Abraham Lincoln. One of the editorials, the paper sounds a bit like a Rush Limbaugh broadcast. Here's what's going to be happening, folks, and you better get with the winning team on this. Those damn Northerners are going to impose abolition of slavery on us, whether we like it or not. This is odd language, considering that California was by law a free state, and its Constitution declared that. But as I say, the secessionists wanted out. They picked one of the leaders of the Latino community, Andres Pico, the brother of Pio Pico, the last Mexican governor of California, to propose it to the Senate. Pico later said, "I regretted it. I did not realize I was dealing with traitors and would-be tyrants." And he had the good sense to repudiate his actions later on. But nonetheless, he proposed the bill. The bill went to the Senate. If it had not been for the outbreak of the Civil War and the work of probably one of the finest Masons who ever lived, California, at least Southern California, would have succeeded. Those of you who read my column know who that person is. Thomas Starr King. Thomas Starr King was educated to be a Unitarian minister. He was from a long-standing Masonic family. And here again, as he grew up in Massachusetts, I see coincidences. The man who he said was the leading influence in his life was Hosea Ballou, Hosea Ballou II. Hosea Ballou II was the uncle to San Luis Obispo sheriff in the 1880s, Stephen D. Ballou, who was a member of this lodge. How's that for coincidence? What are we seeing here, huh? Beginning to see a pattern that this lodge had something to do with keeping Southern California in the Union, if nothing else. And that certainly was Walter Murray's intent. But as I say, we have no surviving Nachlass or papers that tell us much more about it. But we know that there were other connections. One I discovered when I was going through Masonic archives with Barham Wiley some 30 years ago. I found that W.W. Hollister of the famous the town of Hollister, all of San Benito County was once under his ownership, the largest sheep rancher in California, the largest purveyor of wool to the Union during the Civil War. Hollister, partner and by marriage related to Robert Edgar Jack, who I spoke about the last time I was here. Hollister was married by Thomas Starr King in 1862 in San Francisco. How's that for another coincidence? You know, it's all coming together here with this series of coincidences. Thomas Starr King leaves his parish in the Hollis Street Unitarian Church in Boston, one of the most prominent Unitarian parishes in America, to come to California at the behest of a number of leaders of the abolitionist cause, no less a man than William Lloyd Garrison, who edited the abolitionist newspaper, who was a close personal friend. And I have to tell you, King knew everybody in that transcendental Oriental world. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, they were all very, very close. He even dared to say of Longfellow, the poet Longfellow, as in Hiawatha and the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, he's a good poet, but he's nothing like Robert Browning, the English poet. And nonetheless, Longfellow embraced him at their next meeting and said, "You know, you're right," which tells us something about the power of this man. He had the fire of a Saint Ignatius in his eyes, and I have to tell you, I'm doing a set of readings right now which sees the Jesuit order as the mirror image of the Masonic order. It may scandalize some of you, but there's a considerable case to be made for that. He had that fervor that he wrote that the Southern leaders in San Francisco denounced him regularly. And he said, "I welcome their derision, for it increases my crowds." And we have a wonderful photograph taken by Carlton Watkins, the great photographer of the American West, the first man to photograph Yosemite, which, by the way, was another Thomas Starr King creation, even more than John Muir later on. Starr King, who has a mountain named for him inside the park, is instrumental in the creation of the national park at Yosemite. Starr King went from one end of this state to another between 1859 and his death in 1864. He literally wore himself out so that during a diphtheria epidemic he contracted the disease and died. They didn't have a diphtheria vaccine at the time. But he attracted crowds wherever he went. And even in places like Los Angeles, which were very pro-secession, the town of Los Angeles had a population of about 4,300 during the Civil War, and he attracted a crowd of 5,000. Go figure, huh? People came from far in the countryside to hear him, and his message was not lost. He passed through San Luis Obispo many times, maintained a correspondence with Walter Murray and with Alexander Murray, part of which is in the Murray Papers at the Bancroft Library, transcribed by my adoptive mother, Dorothy Bilodeau, who was Walter Murray's granddaughter. It tells the story of a man who was very fearless, who recognized from his own Masonic roots that if we really followed the first principle, this would not be happening, because he said in address after address, the first principle of brotherly love says you don't just embrace your white brother, you embrace your yellow brother, you embrace your black brother. Can you imagine that being said in California in 1861? Huh? People pulled back in horror initially, but other people began to say, you know, that's right. What's right is right, and we need to follow high principle. And here was a man who was not afraid to defy his worst critics. In fact, he was all about that. He's one of these heroes who would stand up in Tiananmen Square in front of a tank if necessary. He had that kind of courage. He inspired the people of San Luis Obispo to stay in the Union. And this was a very difficult thing to do because hard times beset all of Southern California, almost like a scourge from above. The rains stopped in 1863 and didn't resume till 1865. We didn't get a drop of what you would nominally call rain here in San Luis Obispo during that period. There were heavy rain showers in October of 1863, and then it stopped raining. That doesn't sound very good for us this year, does it? Huh? But let's pray that the scourge will not come again. All of the mission-era cattle died off. The economy of the town shrank. Total population of the county is arguable. We think it went from 2,000 down to about 329 at its low point in all of San Luis Obispo County. That was not counting Native Americans, by the way. They counted like the Bible in those days, not counting women and children. Well, we didn't count Chinese or Native Americans. But nonetheless, the county was in pretty bad shape. And so in 1865, Lodge 148 had to surrender its charter. It was not until 1870 that the lodge needed reformation, and the occasion for the unmet need of having a Masonic lodge was when Brother Walter Murray's brother Alexander Murray died, and there was no lodge to conduct a funeral. And again, Murray contacted Romualdo Pacheco and other leaders of the community to reform what became the King David Lodge that we have today. At that point, Murray and Pacheco and others are very busy in another activity. The economy of San Luis Obispo had a miraculous turnaround in 1865, and I've written a lot about it. It's called the dairy boom. The Steele brothers, who were one-time Masons from San Mateo County, who originally started in the Point Reyes Peninsula, where Drake's Bay is located, in fact, and then moved down to western San Mateo County. The College of San Mateo is on former Steele brother lands. The Steele brothers had recognized that Californians needed cheese, especially, and butter. And that very high prices could be generated. The key to success in the dairy industry was to find land that was cheap, that had ample fodder for cattle growing on it. And they found that Point Reyes was too expensive. The oyster bed industry of Tamales Bay and other things made land very expensive there. The land in western San Mateo County was being gradually converted to the growing of crops. During the Civil War, wheat crops, the price of wheat rose in the world index by a factor of 4 because of the demands of the Union Army for bread. The Southern Army did without bread, but they got what flour they could from whatever source. But the Union Army needed bread, needed its hardtack, and it largely came from California. So there was a wheat boom here, and that drove the price of land up to the point where the Steele brothers realized they could no longer rent land, and they ought to sell the land that they have to make maximum profit while they can and find cheap land elsewhere. One of them happened to be riding through San Luis Obispo just after a spring rain in 1865, and they noticed the grass growing up all the way above the stirrups of their horses. And they said, "Eureka! Let's come down here and buy as much land." They bought nearly the whole of the Edna Valley. And the Rancho Corral de Piedra became their headquarters. Their success within a year, producing hundreds of thousands of pounds of cheese and butter, soon made headlines in the San Francisco newspapers, and other people began to flock into here. It was at that point that Walter Murray writes, "Now is the time to bring the right sort of people to Southern California." Who did he mean by the right sort of people? Now, Walter Murray himself was not a racist, and he didn't want to judge people on that grounds. What he meant was people who favored the Union, who were not unreconstructed secessionists, as many were flocking from the Southern armies into the American West. And you'll find these people go to the Arizona Territory, to the New Mexico Territory, to the Montana Territory, so much so that when I was a young boy, the last trip I took with my grandmother in late 1945, we stayed at an old hotel in Missoula, Montana, and it was run by a man who was very proud of being one of the first families of Virginia. And he had pictures of Robert E. Lee in the lobby and in the room. My grandmother was of the opinion that Robert E. Lee should have been shot as a traitor. And my grandmother always, like my dear wife, always expressed her opinions. It became a very quickly uncomfortable situation. You see, I was born to play this role of kind of squishing down. But nonetheless, owner of the hotel took us to our room, and he looked at the picture of Robert E. Lee in the wall in the room, and he took it off the wall. And my grandfather said, "You needn't do that for us." And he said to them, to my grandparents, "I'm thinking of the general, sir. I'm thinking of the general." Well, that was the kind of attitude that Walter Murray did not want to see in San Luis Obispo, and so he began to write letters, lots of letters, to the family of Lou and Horatio Warden from Ohio, to Robert Edgar Steele, to the Hollisters, who also had Ohio roots, and to another family, it took them a while to get here, to the family of Chauncey Hatch Phillips. And again, we begin to see the connections. He used his Masonic connections to get these people to come, if not to San Luis Obispo County, to Santa Barbara County, which included Ventura County in those days. And Murray, who was just about to become judge of what is now the Tri-Counties area, Ventura, Santa Barbara, and San Luis Obispo County, promised them that they would have the warmest reception here, and that he personally would do all that he could do to ensure the success and welfare of their capital ventures in this county. Now, when you have that kind of offer from a man who clearly has influence, you're probably wise to take advantage of it, unless it's a country in West Africa or something, you know. But the people began to flock in. It was a result of Walter Murray's letter that a sea captain originally from Bristol in England, James Cass, who had come to California during the gold rush. Now, Cass grew up in Bristol at a time when the sugar trade was still operating, when the slaving ships had been banned. The British Empire officially banned the slave trade in 1807, but there were still ships in the harbor that had carried slaves from West Africa over to the West Indies and such. And he had seen these ships as a child. One of them was being used as the Bristol jail. And he thought that was an appropriate use, but he said how horrifying the slave trade was. And he comes to California because it is a free state. And he becomes a navigator on the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta system, the same system that brought the mail from the Pony Express from its terminus in Sacramento, California, an old town, you can see that today, and brought it into San Francisco, and Cass was running one of those ships. He's invited by Walter Murray into San Luis Obispo, and of course he essentially takes the Rancho Cayucos y Moro and founds the town of Cayucos, building a long wharf where ships can dock to receive the dairy product from that region. Almost as many dairy farms as there were here in San Luis Obispo, there were many more in the hinterlands and back of Cayucos, and they needed service. Almost all of these figures who came to San Luis Obispo at Walter Murray's behest are interested in transportation, and I think the big connection here is the role that Abraham Lincoln played in linking up the America that we have today. It was Lincoln in the Morrill Act of 1862 that said we will subsidize a transcontinental railroad to link New York and Chicago with San Francisco. Now, that's an odd thing to do in wartime, isn't it? You know, you have all the expense of the Civil War, but what is along that route? Well, I can tell you right now, the Southern Pacific, now Union Pacific switching yards, just outside of Reno, Nevada, tell it all. You go 30 miles south from there, and you go up in the mountains, and where are you? Virginia City, the silver capital of the world at that time. And it said that the Comstock lode, which is what we call the discovery of silver ore in Virginia City, paid the debts of the Union during the Civil War. He was afraid that the Confederate Army might come up from the Arizona Territory, and the Confederates planned to do exactly that, and seize Virginia City. And the only way to secure it to the Union was to build a railroad. And as Lincoln enunciated time and time again, transportation is what will ultimately link all Americans to one another so that brother will no longer be in mortal combat with another brother. And that principle of federalism was very important to almost all of these Republicans who come to San Luis Obispo during this time. P.J. Reddy is someone else who comes a little later than this, but he illustrates another type of immigrant that Walter Murray especially admired. People who had come from the potato famine in Ireland, who knew the downside. These were the 47%ers of their era, huh? And they had nearly starved to death. They were lucky enough to come to New York. Now, admittedly, there were draft riots in New York. As you know, a orphanage for black children was burnt down by angry Irish people who had just come off the docks. But you have to understand what was happening to the Irish. As a man between the ages of 14 and 35 got off the ship, guess who was there to greet him? The Union drafted people, yeah. And I can understand, because to be drafted in the Civil War, which introduced rifled weapons for the first time on a large scale, was almost a death sentence, wasn't it? And if you didn't die of a bullet wound or shrapnel from the artillery, you'd probably die from some of the pestilence that periodically ran through the armies at that time. So we can understand that. But the Reddys came west, and they came in a pattern through West Virginia, which is a part of Virginia that was opposed to slavery, on into California. And while they arrived after Walter Murray's, or just at the time of Walter Murray's death, nonetheless, they represent that sort of people that Murray wanted here in Southern California, particularly in San Luis Obispo County, to prevent our falling back into the mode that we had on the eve of the Civil War. Chauncey Hatch Phillips is perhaps the exemplar of this idea. Phillips came from Ohio. He came from an abolitionist background. His parents subscribed to William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator magazine. He carried with him a book that we all probably have read by Harriet Beecher Stowe called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And one of the saddest things that I know of was that that book was bequeathed to the Santa Clara County Historical Society and apparently lost in a fire at the fairgrounds some 20 years ago, but it would be precious to have. Chauncey Hatch was a partner of Horatio Warden in founding the first Bank of San Luis Obispo in 1869. That's the first permanent bank. I hesitate to use the word permanent. They intended it to be permanent. Unfortunately, it was linked to James Ralston's Bank of California. And if you're a fan of California history, you know what happened to that bank in 1875. When the Bank of California failed, Ralston, who regularly took swims in the bay, didn't come back to the Long Wharf in San Francisco. He presumably was a suicide, and tens of thousands of investors went down with him. The Bank of San Luis Obispo was dissolved at that time, and Chauncey Hatch Phillips and Horatio Warden together announced, we are no longer going to be involved in banking. Mr. Warden is going into farming, and I'm going into transportation. Now, it's very interesting how the way he went into transportation. He started something called the West Coast Land Company. The West Coast Land Company included amongst its directors R.E. Jack, W.W. Hollister, and initially Walter Murray was asked to be a member of this group also. P.J. Reddy would also work for the group at different times in its history. Practically every member of its board was someone who had received a letter from Brother Walter Murray here in the King David Lodge, an invitation to San Luis Obispo County. The West Coast Land Company was instrumental in attracting the Pacific Coast Steamship Company to build an inland railway that went from San Luis Obispo to eventually Santa Ynez, to the Santa Ynez Valley, to the town of Los Olivos. You know, when you pass the Maddie's Inn on the San Marcos Road, you'll see a tower there that looks rather strange for a horse-drawn inn, huh? It's a railroad watering tower. And just beyond that, where the flagpole sits in Los Olivos, you'll see the turnaround for the engine. It's no larger, it's a platform like one of the cable car turnarounds in San Francisco, but the train would push the cars back. It would pull them there and push the cars back to San Luis Obispo, and then ultimately out to Port San Luis, where the butter, the cheese, the gravel from the gravel pits east of Seasquac and towns like that, east of Santa Maria and such, could be shipped out to the sea. Later on, this is very much related to Jack Spaulding's profession, it would ship out tar, wouldn't it, Jack? Tar that would be used initially for paving the streets. The streets of Redwood City, California, were amongst the first streets. The county seat of San Mateo County were the first to be paved with this tar. People complained it was kind of sticky, but it was a lot better than the dust that was there before. San Luis Obispo, incidentally, never bothered to pave its streets while this cheap tar was around. We had to import macadam from somewhere else. But then another use was discovered for that tar. Placing it in a retort, you could generate manufactured gas for gas lights. And in the days before natural gas lines brought natural gas to our homes, that's what people burned. If you look on at Pismo and Archer Street, you'll see the gas works here in San Luis Obispo that was built initially, again, by agents of the West Coast Land Company. It generated gas in retorts. The problems only came when San Luis Obispo's water commissioner, Louis B. Sinsheimer, also a member of this lodge, came up with the bright idea that electricity was eventually going to replace gas. Where are we going to put our dynamo for generating electricity? Well, we have room down there in that sandstone structure. Bad idea, huh? A little leaking gas and kaboom. That's why the building only basically has two sides to this day. But nonetheless, the spirit of progress was coming about through the activities of the West Coast Land Company. Having gotten the little railroad to come through here, Chauncey Hatch Phillips begins to sell lots along the right-of-way of that railroad, and he thought bigger and bigger. He started with a tract of land initially in Nipomo, and then in Los Barros, and then a little further south in a place he initially called Central City, which we know better as Santa Maria, huh? And then a little further south in Orcutt, because he knew something was there that Jack again was intimately connected with. That was the main fields of the Union Oil Company of California, wasn't it?
Old Maud was the first well.
The what?
Old Maud was the first well.
Old Maud was the first well, and Chauncey Hatch Phillips knew from what geologists were telling him, including Mr. Orcutt himself, that this was a good venture to go through, and this would be a way to ship the oil out to the wharf, huh? And get it out to sea. And that's an activity that carried on, eventually replaced by pipelines, but initially this made San Luis Obispo a very, very important place. The port where the railroad came out became the most important oil port in the world, because oil from the Central Valley now came over in the world's first long-range pipeline. So this became a very, very significant, and Jack was very instrumental in the management of that line, and nearly lost his life on the wharf back in 1983. Phillips develops these towns. He had a problem, however, when it came to developing the town of Los Alamos in 1884. It started, pardon me, in 1887. It started to rain and didn't stop raining. and nobody showed up. He did the typical California thing. He invited everybody with free rail passage from San Luis Obispo to Los Alamos. 2 hours and 10 minutes, by the way, was the optimal speed of the train at that time. And there was going to be a barbecue and sell you some land. Well, people got there in this pouring rain, and they saw the mud that was at least 6 or 7 inches deep outside the train. They never got off the train. They said, "Take us back to San Luis." And he lost his shirt on that one, but that did not deflect him. He thought even bigger. He met another person associated with this lodge, Myron Angel, and they began to talk about tracking the big railroad. See, railroads have different gauges, and the Pacific Coast Railway that went south from the depot here at South Street and Higuera Street was only 3 feet wide. The standard railroad tracks are 4 feet 8.5 inches wide, the width of a Roman chariot axle. Can you imagine how some things stick in history? It's because so many of the wheels of the wagons used all the way through the 19th century had to fit the ruts in the old Roman roads that were being used in the Milanese part of the world. Fosse Way and Watling Street had Roman roads that were still usable. They were used by General Patton's tanks during World War II. They were the only roads that really held up under that kind of usage. That 4 feet 8.5 inches standard gauge railway was very costly to build. The people who had a monopoly on building it, the Big Four, Leland Stanford, Mark Hopkins, Charles Crocker, Collis B. Huntington. Collis Huntington had an absolute monopoly on the development of railroads here in California until the Santa Fe Railroad came in the 1890s. And as a consequence, attracting the Southern Pacific, the SP, to San Luis Obispo was not going to be an easy task. Nonetheless, Chauncey Hatch Phillips sat down to it. He was the principal agent, making offers to the Southern Pacific. Now, the Big Four made some money from Abraham Lincoln's railroads subsidies. The subsidies were originally set at $20,000 a mile for flat land, $40,000 a mile for hilly land, and $60,000 to $80,000 a mile for mountainous land. They bribed the California State Surveyor to say the Sierra Nevada mountains started at 1st and J Street in Sacramento. And if you know Sacramento, that's the flattest part of the earth, I think. But nonetheless, they made good money there. But you know where they made their big money? For every mile of land, you got an adjoining square, every mile of track, you got an adjoining square mile of land. And if it was through bad country, you got good land elsewhere. All of what is now Orange County was railroad lieu land to the Southern Pacific Railroad. Most of that, I'm happy to say, fell to Collis's nephew, Henry Huntington, who used his money to endow one of my favorite libraries, where I've had the privilege to be one of the fellows in San Marino, California. It was Collis Huntington that Chauncey Hatch Phillips had to deal with. Collis Huntington was a man so mean that his wife eventually left him and married the nephew, which is an interesting, keep it all in the family, huh? A man who was said to chew steel rail and spit out steel tacks. That expression was invented to fit him by Mark Twain. And was no easy person. Collis said to Phillips at their first meeting, "Why should I build a railroad that comes through San Luis Obispo? I built a railroad as far as the King Ranch, now King City, but that's all the further I need to come. We're introducing a new crop there called sugar beets. There'll be plenty of sugar beets on the market. No need for me to go any further south. As for going further south, I've built a route that goes through the Central Valley, through all the populated cities of the Central Valley, from Stockton to Modesto, on south to Bakersfield, which was then called the Kern Island Land Company, but Colonel Baker was busy selling lots down there, making money from it. No need to come to through San Luis Obispo at all. Phillips was not going to be discouraged. He went back time and time again. And to the extent that he succeeded, we have, of course, the 5th of May, 1894, when the cannon that's now down in our cemetery, Old Abe, a Civil War Union cannon, fired hourly, waiting for the arrival of the first train from the King Ranch to come into San Luis Obispo. The Stenner Trestle was completed, and San Luis Obispo began to put itself on the map. It was only with that creation of a railroad link on standard gauge rail that San Luis Obispo could truly enter the 20th century. Cal Poly came about because the railroad passed right through San Luis Obispo, which now, by the way, poor Santa Maria, called Central City, said, well, they'll have to come through here. We're not going to do what San Luis Obispo did at Mr. Phillips' behest. That was to offer $250,000 cash during the bad days of the recession in the 1890s, and a huge amount of acreage here in San Luis Obispo to Collis Huntington. We won't do that. Well, Collis Huntington said, we'll go west, 10 miles west to Guadalupe, and Central City became something else, Santa Maria. But when the railroad came all the way through San Luis, when it was finished in 1901, it made it an attractive place for a state university. The state university turned out to be a place where people would be trained not just with the mind, but with the hand, in Myron Angel's words, remembering how when he came to San Francisco during the gold rush, having lost everything in a flood as he traveled across the continental United States, didn't have a penny to his name. Somebody offered him $10 a day to nail shingles on a roof, and he didn't know how to drive a nail. And it was out of that that Cal Poly's idea was born. But without the railroad, would there have been a Cal Poly? Without the railroad, would there have been a Camp San Luis Obispo, the third largest military reservation in the world, because of the vision, not just of Myron Angel, but the activity of Lodge brother Chauncey Hatch Phillips. Phillips had a house here in San Luis Obispo. And he heard that there was a fancy Englishman who had established a little ranch in the hinterland behind the village of Arroyo Grande along the Pacific Coast route. The ranch was called the Tally-Ho because guess what they did there? Fox hunting. And of course, Horace Ainsley Vachel, who was from England, one of the leading novelists in England at the time, introduced the fox to the region, to the curse of every turkey and chicken farmer who ever farmed in this county, by the way. But they, nonetheless, they met up, and Phillips says to Vachel, you know, you have a fine son. I love the way he holds the saddle as he rides after foxes. And I've got a beautiful daughter. And he wrote almost all his friends, my daughter is marrying into English nobility. Now, I have to tell you, I interviewed the last secretary that Chauncey Hatch, that Horace Ainsley Vachel had back in, was it 1986 when I was in London Quarter. I interviewed her, and she said that Horace Ainsley Vachel was horrified at the primitive family that this civilized Englishman's daughter was married into. Primitive he may have been, but he was a builder. He moved to Templeton, where his house still stands at the northeast end of Main Street in Templeton. How many of you have been to his house? It's a bed and breakfast now. And it's, if you're driving through Templeton, if you're going to see my student Ian McPhee, go early and ask if you can walk through the bed and breakfast. It was sort of a mansion in its day. And he persuaded Vachel to move to San Luis Obispo to be closer to him. He sold him the lot, by the way. And again, all these things kind of pull together, don't they? Vachel went back to England. Chauncey Hatch Phillips was closely connected to the family of General Patrick Murphy. And rather interesting because Phillips was a Republican. General Patrick Murphy was a long-standing Democrat and candidate for a number of offices on behalf of the Democratic Party. He usually lost to Romualdo Pacheco, who in 1875 briefly becomes governor of California, the only partly Mexican-American ever to do so. And again, I think that speaks to the diversity of this lodge. But nonetheless, the Murphy family had been very generous with the county, building one of the first private hospitals here. And General Murphy later, he was a Civil War general in the California National Guard, later removed to the Santa Clara Valley to a ranch named after his father, Martin Murphy. And we call that just north of Gilroy, San Martin today. That's where the airport is that you pass north of Gilroy after you pass that off-goods center or whatever it is. He thought he was going to develop that area. He went belly up in both places as a result, and his land was up for sale. Chauncey Hatch Phillips bought the land, and unfortunately when he dies in 1904, the San Jose Register notes that he probably didn't make a penny off of it, and he died nearly bankrupt. But what he left behind was an infrastructure for the future. He was also the person who envisioned the modern El Camino Real, a paved highway, and he was instrumental in beginning the lobbying effort that later led to State Highway 2, which is now today's Highway 101 in Sacramento. In the 1890s, he was talking about this. He knew the automobile was here to stay, although he envisioned largely electric automobiles that would require charging stations every 50 miles along the way, and he was going to make some money off of that also. Chevy Volt, let's hear it, huh? Yeah. This is all connected to this wonderful lodge and to the very rich history that we have here in San Luis Obispo. Some of the most colorful characters you would find anywhere. Sometime I would like to come and tell you some stories about Sheriff Stephen Ballou, which is goes off in another direction. But the simple beginning of Hosea Ballou II, president of Tufts University, inspiring a young Unitarian minister through the fervor that's helped save California during the Civil War. And then the nephew coming here to San Luis Obispo. No accident. This was a friend to homeless Republicans from across the land, and it was the making of San Luis Obispo that we have today. Thank you very much.